They made her carry the luggage, the queen, with her own hands, into the bedroom that was hers, while the whole court watched and said nothing. If you think you've seen cruelty dressed up as royalty, you haven't seen anything yet. Stay until the end, because what Serafina Vale does next will remind you that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone just decided doesn't matter anymore. Hit that like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. Ding. The candles in the grand corridor burned low by the time the last toast was raised, and the smoke from 300 wax pillars had thickened the air inside the palace into something close to fog. It was the night of abundance, the kingdom's oldest celebration, the one night each year when even the poorest villages lit fires in their courtyards, and the nobility set aside their grudges long enough to drink from the same gilded cups. The chandeliers overhead dripped crystal light across silk and armor and powdered faces, and the musicians had been playing since the sun went down, a relentless bright sound that filled the corridors and the staircases and even the spaces between people where silence might have said something honest. Queen Serafina Vale stood near the arched window at the far end of the royal hall and watched it all with the particular stillness of someone who had learned, years ago, that stillness was its own kind of armor. She was 34 years old. She had been queen for 11 of those years, wife to Cedric Ashbourne for 12, and a stranger to him for most of that time. Her gown tonight was deep burgundy. She had chosen it herself, which was one of the few choices she was still permitted to make without interference. Her dark hair was pinned at the back of her head in the old Valian style, simple and severe, the way her mother had worn it. There were no jewels at her throat. She had given up wearing them years ago when she'd noticed that Cedric's eyes never moved to her regardless of what she put on. The hall was loud with laughter she hadn't caused and warmth she didn't feel. Lord Fenwick Aldous found her at the window, the way he often did at these gatherings. Old Aldous, who had served her father-in-law before Cedric took the throne, who had the hands of a farmer and the memory of a magistrate, and who stood close to Serafina now not because he was required to, but because he'd chosen to every time for 11 years. "You're doing it again," he said quietly, not looking at her. "Doing what?" "Standing like you're already somewhere else." She didn't answer. Across the hall, Cedric was laughing at something Lord Caro had said. He was handsome when he laughed. She'd noticed that when she first met him, when she was 22 and he was 30, and the whole world had told her this was a fortunate match. He still had the look of someone who deserved good fortune. That was the particular cruelty of him. He wore his failures on other people. "He brought her," Aldous said. "I know." "To the night of abundance." "I said I know, Aldous." The old man was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you all right?" Serafina turned her head just slightly and looked at him. His face was the same face it had always been. Weathered, careful, loyal in the plain way that plain men sometimes were, without drama or declaration. She looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the hall. "I'm fine," she said. She was not fine, but she had stopped expecting fine some years back, and what she had found on the other side of that expectation was something steadier, something that didn't require a name. Lady Morel Voss arrived in the hall at the second hour of the celebration, and the room shifted around her the way rooms shifted around beautiful women who had learned to use beauty as a tool rather than a trait. She was 26, taller than Serafina, with the kind of coloring that candlelight was practically designed to flatter, gold hair and a pale complexion, and dark eyes that knew exactly where they were pointed. Her gown was amber silk. Her jewelry was new. Serafina recognized 3 pieces from the royal collection that had gone missing from the inventory last spring. She entered on Cedric's arm. He had gone to retrieve her himself. The musicians missed a beat. The conversations didn't stop, but they changed temperature. Serafina watched Morel cross the hall and did not look away. There was a version of this night she had rehearsed in her mind, in the months since Morel had come to the palace under the title of Lady-in-Waiting, which was a title that had not fooled anyone. In the rehearsed version, Serafina maintained perfect composure, drank a measured amount of wine, spoke to the right people at the right intervals, and left at a reasonable hour with her dignity intact. She had been running that version of herself for 3 seasons now. What she had not rehearsed was what happened next. Cedric moved through the crowd with Morel beside him, greeting nobles and accepting compliments on the festivity, the spread of food, the musicians, the decorations, all of which his household staff had arranged and none of which he had overseen. Serafina watched his hand at the small of Morel's back, the proprietary ease of it. She watched Morel tilt her head back and laugh at something, and the laugh was designed to travel, and it did. They reached the center of the hall. Cedric's voice, when he raised it, had the particular quality of a man who had never needed to repeat himself because the room always went quiet for him. Friends. That was all he said, and the musicians stopped and the conversations died and 300 people turned. Serafina felt something shift in the air, something with weight. Tonight is a celebration of abundance, Cedric said. He was smiling. He had a smile that suggested generosity without requiring any actual giving. And it seems only right that we honor abundance in all its forms. He raised his cup. Including the good fortune of finding, at this late stage of my life, a woman whose presence has made this palace a lighter place. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a crowd that knows something is coming and has not yet decided whether to pretend otherwise. Morel looked at the floor with practiced modesty. Serafina didn't move. She was standing 30 feet from the center of the hall, and she could feel Aldous beside her go very still. Lady Morel will be occupying the royal chamber tonight, Cedric said. Conversational. Like he was announcing a change of menu. As is appropriate for a woman of her standing. The silence changed. It went from taut to something else. Something with a flinch in it. Serafina's hands were folded in front of her. She did not unfold them. Cedric turned his head, and his eyes found her across the hall with the particular accuracy of someone who had been looking for her all along. Serafina. His voice carried without effort. You'll see to it that your chamber is cleared tonight. The guest rooms on the east wing are prepared. 300 people were looking at her. She had thought, she had believed, in some durable and apparently foolish corner of herself, that whatever Cedric chose to do, he would not do it here. Not in the hall, not on the night of abundance. Not in front of Lord Aldous and General Thane and Judge Morwell and the 12 provincial envoys who had traveled from across the kingdom and were standing 40 feet away holding cups of wine. She had believed there was a floor. There wasn't. Serafina held Cedric's gaze across the hall for a long moment. The musicians had not resumed. Nothing had resumed. The entire weight of the room was balanced on her next breath. Of course, she said. Her voice was steady. She had worked very hard to make it steady, and it was. And she hated that it had to be. Cedric smiled and turned back to the crowd and raised his cup again. To abundance, he said, and 300 people drank, some enthusiastically, some mechanically, some with their eyes down. Serafina turned and walked toward the corridor. She heard Morel's laughter resume behind her before she reached the door. The corridor outside the hall was lit at intervals by iron wall sconces, and the sound from the celebration came through the stone walls as a low, muffled pulse, like something alive and indifferent. Serafina walked it without hurrying, without looking at the servants who pressed back against the walls when they saw her coming, without making any sound except the soft rhythm of her shoes on the stone. She reached the back staircase, the servants' route, which she had learned years ago because it was faster and because no one used it who had any interest in being seen. She climbed it to the upper corridor, turned left, and pushed open the door to the royal chamber. The room smelled of her. That was the first thing she noticed. It smelled of the cedar sachets she kept in the wardrobe, and the particular soap the laundress used on the linen, and the dried herbs she kept on the table by the window because she had trouble sleeping, and the herbalist had suggested it 3 years ago. 11 years of her had accumulated in this room. The books stacked on the low shelf beside the fireplace, their spines cracked from use. The writing desk in the corner with its particular arrangement of inkwells and correspondence, the smallest of which she had inherited from her mother. The worn patch on the rug beside the bed from the years she had pasted in the dark when Cedric's absences kept her awake, not from longing, but from the kind of anxious uncertainty that had no object and no resolution. She stood in the room and looked at it. Then she went to the wardrobe and began taking out her things. She was methodical. She had always been methodical. It was what she fell back on when the alternative was something she couldn't afford. She took the gowns from their hangers and folded them over her arm, and she carried them to the empty trunk she kept under the bed for travel, and she laid them in carefully. She took the correspondence from the desk. She took the books from the shelf. She took the cedar sachets from the wardrobe and the herb bundles from the window table and the small silver mirror that had belonged to her grandmother and the 2 letters she kept in the locked box in the drawer that she hadn't read in years but couldn't bring herself to give up. By the time she was finished, the trunk was 3/4 full, and the room already looked like somewhere she had never lived. She sat on the edge of the bed, just for a moment. The linen was cool under her hands. She thought about the first night she had slept in this room, the night after the wedding, when she was 22 years old and had believed she was building something. She thought about the early years, when she and Cedric had disagreed with the productive friction of 2 people who both had opinions about the kingdom, before he began making decisions without consulting her, before the consulting had stopped being a courtesy and became an inconvenience, before the inconvenience had curdled into something that didn't have a polite name. She thought about the moment, 3 years into the marriage, when she had understood that the kingdom in her mind and the kingdom in his were not the same place. She didn't cry. She had cried about Cedric many times over the years, but the crying had always been private and had always been about something more specific than him, about loneliness, about waste, about the particular grief of watching someone choose smallness over and over when they had the capacity for more. She had cried herself past him, somewhere in the 7th year. What was left now was not grief. It was something cleaner than grief, and sharper, and she was only beginning to understand its shape. She stood up, took the handles of the trunk, and pulled it toward the door. The knock came before she reached it. She stopped. "Enter," she said. The door opened, and one of the junior hall servants, a boy named Pell, 16 years old, who had worked in the palace for 2 years and who she knew by name because she made it her practice to know the names of the people who worked in rooms she occupied, stood in the doorframe with his face doing something complicated and uncomfortable. "Your Majesty," he said, and then stopped. "What is it, Pell?" He swallowed. "His Majesty sent word that Lady Morell's trunks are in the lower hall. He requests that you bring them up." The sentence ended. Pell was not looking at her. Serafina was quiet for a moment. "How many trunks?" she said. "4, Your Majesty." She thought about the corridor below. She thought about the route from the lower hall to the upper corridor, the main staircase which everyone used, where she would be visible to anyone who cared to look. She thought about Cedric, who knew exactly what he was asking and had calculated exactly what it would look like. "All right," she said. Pell looked up. His face had gone from uncomfortable to something that was trying very hard not to be distress. "Your Majesty, I could carry them myself or ask—" "That won't be necessary." "Ma'am." Pell. Her voice was not unkind. It was just final. "Go back downstairs." He went. She heard his footsteps retreat down the corridor, quick and unhappy. Serafina left her own trunk where it was and went to the main staircase. The 4 trunks were stacked near the lower hall entrance, gilded and monogrammed in amber thread, M.V. Lady Morell Voss, as if the palace needed reminding. They were heavy. The first one she took by the handle and dragged, which was not graceful, and she did not care about grace. The main staircase was lit from above, and 2 footmen were stationed at its base, and they watched her approach without moving. She stopped in front of them. "Are you going to help me?" she said, "or are your orders to stand there?" Neither of them spoke. Their faces were the faces of men who had been given instructions and were suffering them. "That's what I thought," she said, and took the first trunk's handle and started up the stairs. The sound of it going up the stone steps was loud. It echoed. It was not a dignified sound. She had always moved through this palace with a particular quiet efficiency, and now every step she climbed announced itself. She passed Lord Caro on the second landing. He was coming down from somewhere above, unsteady with wine, and when he saw her he stopped and stared, and she watched his face move through several expressions without landing on any of them, and she didn't slow down. She passed Lady Hen and her daughter, who pressed back against the wall. Lady Henny had been a friend of hers once, or something adjacent to a friend. They had taken meals together and discussed the running of the provincial household budgets and exchanged information about the families they both knew. Lady Henny's daughter was 18 years old and watching Serafina with an expression that was too young to be strategic and too old to be innocent. She delivered the first trunk to the royal chamber, which was not yet occupied. Morel was still in the hall. The performance of the evening was not yet complete. She set the trunk down inside the door and went back for the second. By the fourth trip, her shoulders were burning. She had not dressed for labor. Her gown was in the way, and she gathered it with one hand on the stairs and did not think about how she looked and did not look at the people she passed. Not because she was ashamed, but because she was somewhere inside herself that required privacy, a small, hot interior room that she had built years ago and where she went when the outside world required too much performance. The fourth trunk went down inside the royal chamber door. She straightened. She pressed her palm flat against the door frame for a moment, not gripping, just steadying. Then she turned and went to collect her own trunk from the corridor. The east guest room was smaller than the royal chamber by a considerable degree. It had one window and one chair and a bed that had been hastily made up with linens that were clean but thin, the spares that came out when the main linen supply was occupied. There was no writing desk. There was a small table near the window that could serve the function, but it was low and the chair didn't match it, and it would not be comfortable. She brought her trunk in and did not unpack it. She sat in the chair and looked at the window. The Night of Abundance celebration was still going below. She could hear the music faintly and the occasional burst of grouped laughter. She put her hands on her knees. She thought, this is the floor. If there was a floor, this is it. She also thought, he made a mistake. That second thought arrived quietly, without fanfare, the way certain true things arrived. Cedric had stood in front of 300 people and pointed at her and said she didn't matter, and she had carried another woman's trunks up the main staircase where every servant and nobleman in the palace could see, and he had believed that this would break something in her. He had believed that because he had been believing it for years. That humiliation was a form of management, that shame was quieter than conflict, that a woman who kept her composure under pressure was a woman who had accepted her position. He had never once considered that composure and submission were different things. What had actually happened tonight, in that hall, was that he had given every person who witnessed it something they couldn't unfeel. Lord Aldous, who had been careful and measured and uncommitted for 3 years, would not be careful after tonight. General Thane, who owed Serafina's father more than he had ever fully paid, would have a new weight on that ledger. The 12 provincial envoys who had come to the Night of Abundance expecting spectacle and had gotten something else entirely would take what they saw back to their provinces, and it would travel faster than any official correspondence could follow. And the servants. The servants, who saw everything and were seen by no one. Pell standing in that doorway with his face doing complicated mathematics. The 2 footmen at the base of the stairs. The maids who would make up the royal chamber for a woman who had not earned her place there. Cedric had never once learned that the people who carried your luggage were the same people who remembered exactly what you asked them to carry. Serafina looked at her hands. They were not the hands of someone who had spent 11 years being managed. They were the hands of someone who had spent 11 years learning a palace, one room at a time, in the way you learned a difficult territory, carefully, without announcing your knowledge, accumulating it like water accumulating behind a dam that looks, from the outside, perfectly still. She thought about the ledger she kept in the locked compartment of her correspondence box, the one written in her own hand in the private notation she had developed for exactly this purpose. 3 columns, 3 years of entries, names and dates and sums, and the particular details that gave each entry its teeth. She thought about the letters she had collected, not stolen, never stolen, simply retained from the correspondence that had passed through her hands as queen, the correspondence that certain parties had not expected her to read carefully and others had not expected her to keep. She thought about Lord Justice Arundel, who had served her father-in-law and who had sent her a message 6 months ago, through a channel that was not the official correspondence system, asking only whether she still had faith in the rule of law. She had not answered it. She was not ready to answer it then. She thought she was beginning to be ready now. She stood up. The candle on the table had burned low, and the celebration below was quieting. It would be near the 3rd hour when the older nobility made their excuses and the younger ones continued without supervision. The Night of Abundance would end by morning, and tomorrow the palace would return to its ordinary rhythms, and Cedric would wake in the royal chamber, or perhaps not in the royal chamber, Perhaps he would not stay the whole night. She had never known with certainty how much of his attachment to Morel was genuine and how much was performance, and he would expect that the night's events had settled something. Serafina went to the small table at the window. She didn't have her writing desk. She didn't have the proper inkwell. She had a candle and a portable ink case she'd packed reflexively from the royal chamber, one of the items she'd included in the trunk without fully deciding why, and she had the paper she'd taken from the correspondence drawer. She sat down and she wrote 3 letters. The first was to Lord Aldous, who she knew would be awake for another hour at least, who had always preferred to drink his last cup of the evening alone in his study on the east side of the 2nd floor. She did not write about what had happened tonight. She wrote only, "I would like to speak with you in the morning, before the household wakes. You know where I'll be. S." The second was to General Bryce Thane, who was not in the palace tonight, but who was stationed at the garrison on the palace grounds. She wrote, "My father's words to you in his last year were spoken in trust and never called in. Consider this the calling. Send word when you can receive a visitor. The visitor will come alone and before dawn. Serafina Vale, Queen of Ashbourne." She paused over the third for longer. The third was to a woman she had not contacted directly in 2 years, a woman named Dara Wynne, who had once served as her personal secretary and who had been removed from that position by Cedric 3 years into the marriage, when he had begun to be uncomfortable with the quality of information Serafina possessed. Dara Wynne now kept an account house in the city's merchant quarter and knew the financial movement of the kingdom's nobility better than anyone who worked inside the palace walls, because outside the walls was where money actually moved. She wrote, "The time I said might come has come. I need what you have on the Voss accounts, where the money went and where it came from and who knew. I will pay in the currency we discussed. You have 2 days before it becomes urgent." She sealed all 3 letters with plain wax, not her queen's seal, which Cedric had the authority to query, and she folded them into her correspondence case. She would not send them tonight. Tonight was not the time for anything that required speed. Speed was how you made mistakes, and Serafina Vale had been making her plans in the slow, undetectable manner of someone who had learned that patience was not the same as passivity, and that a woman who was believed to be broken was a woman who could move without being watched. She extinguished the candle. She did not undress. She lay on the thin linened bed with her hands folded over her chest in the dark, and she listened to the last sounds of the night of abundance fading below. And she thought about Cedric standing in the hall with his cup raised, and she thought about the 300 faces that had turned to look at her, and she thought about the look on Pell's face in the doorway, and she thought about carrying 4 trunks of another woman's belongings up the main staircase of her own palace. She thought, let him believe it worked. Let them all believe it. Let them believe she had been humiliated into quietness, because quiet was what she needed, and humiliation was the gift he hadn't known he was giving. She closed her eyes. And in the darkness of the East guest room, with her own things still packed in an unpacked trunk and 3 unsigned letters in her correspondence case, Queen Serafina Vale of Ashbourne felt, for the first time in years, the very particular sensation of a woman who has nothing left to lose and has just realized that nothing left to lose is not the end. It was the beginning. She did not sleep long. 2 hours, perhaps less. She woke before the palace did, in that thick pre-dawn stillness when the corridor outside was empty and the servants hadn't begun their first rounds and the celebration's debris was still waiting to be cleared. She dressed, smoothed her gown, pinned her hair back in the Valiant style, took her correspondence case. She opened the door to the east corridor and stepped out, and stopped. Standing outside the door was Pell. The boy looked like he hadn't slept. He was still in his hall service uniform from the night before, and he was holding a small tray with a covered cup on it, and his expression when he saw her had the complicated architecture of someone who had spent a long time deciding to do something and had only just committed to doing it. "Your Majesty," he said. She looked at him. "Pell." "I made tea." He held out the tray. "The kitchen is dark, but I know where they keep the... It's just tea. I didn't know if you, He stopped. He was young enough that sincerity came out of him without strategy, and it was genuine enough to be almost painful. "I'm sorry about last night," he said. "I should have carried those trunks myself, and I didn't, and I've been standing here for an hour trying to figure out how to say that." Serafina looked at the boy for a long moment. Then she took the cup from the tray. "You were following your king's orders," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And yet you're here." "Yes, ma'am." She held the cup in both hands. The warmth of it ran up through her palms. "What's your family name, Pell?" "Danworth, Your Majesty." "Pell Danworth." She looked at him steadily. "You're going to be reassigned, not by me, by the household in the next few days when people start rearranging themselves. When that happens, I want you to request a position in the East Wing Correspondence Office. Tell Master Holt I recommended you. Can you write?" "Yes, ma'am. My mother taught me letters and numbers both." "Good," she said. "Go get some sleep." He bowed awkwardly, with the energy of someone who wasn't sure of the correct form, but felt that something formal was required. And he went. Serafina stood alone in the corridor with her cup of tea and her correspondence case and the quiet of the pre-dawn palace, and she thought about the 3 letters, and she thought about Lord Aldous in his study, and she thought about General Thane in the garrison, and she thought about Dara Wynne in the merchant quarter with her account books, and her 2 years of accumulated financial records on the nobility of Ashbourne. She thought about the Grand Assembly, 3 months from now, the one Cedric was already planning, the one where he had told Lord Caro, in the conversation she'd been within earshot of last month and had given no sign of hearing, that he intended to formalize Morell's position permanently. She drank the tea. It was strong and plain and not particularly good, made by someone who knew where the kettle was but not much else about tea-making. It was, she thought, exactly what she needed. She walked to the end of the east corridor and turned toward the servants' staircase. There was light beginning somewhere at the edges of the sky, a faint gray change in the dark that wasn't quite dawn, but was its announcement. She had letters to send and people to see and a palace to learn all over again, now that everything she'd believed about its floors had turned out to be wrong. She descended the stairs. Behind her in the royal chamber at the other end of the palace, she did not know it yet, but a letter had already been slid under the door. Not from Cedric, who was not the kind of man who sent letters, but from someone whose handwriting she would recognize immediately, someone who had been waiting for 3 years to send exactly this message, someone whose position inside the palace gave them access to information that Serafina had not yet realized she needed. The letter began, "They're not planning to wait until the Grand Assembly." That was the first thing Serafina noticed. Standing at the bottom of the servants' staircase, with the pre-dawn gray beginning to separate the sky from itself outside the narrow window above her. She had turned back for it when Pell mentioned, in his awkward, exhausted way, that one of the night maids had slipped something under the east guest room door while he was standing watch. He'd meant to mention it earlier, he said. He'd forgotten in the nerves of the moment. She'd gone back up. Read it standing in the doorway with the candle she'd relit. They're not planning to wait until the Grand Assembly. No signature. The handwriting was controlled, deliberate, the kind of hand that had been trained to give nothing away. But the paper was palace stock. She recognized the weight of it, the slight cream tint that distinguished it from the cheaper correspondence paper used in the outer offices. Whoever had sent it worked inside the palace walls and had access to the upper corridors and knew which room she'd been put in, which meant they'd been watching the Night of Abundance closely enough to track her movements after Cedric's announcement. She folded the letter into her correspondence case. Then she continued down the stairs. Lord Aldous was where she'd expected him to be, in his study on the east side of the second floor, the one with the low fire and the walls of document cases that went floor to ceiling and smelled of old parchment and the particular pipe tobacco he'd given up smoking 5 years ago, but whose ghost apparently hadn't left. He was not sitting. He was standing at the window with a cup in his hand, and when she knocked and entered, he turned with the expression of a man who had not slept and had spent the hours making decisions. "You got my note," she said. "I got your note," he said. "I was coming to you regardless." She sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited, which was something she had started doing 2 years ago when the formalities between them had begun to feel like a waste of the time they didn't have. He remained standing. The fire was low, but the room was warm, and in the gray early light coming through the window, Aldous looked older than he had last night. Or perhaps he just looked like what he was, which was a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had decided to set it down. "Tell me what you know," she said. "What do you know already?" The letter first. He looked at her. What letter? She took it from her case and set it on the desk between them. He read it without picking it up. His face didn't change, but something around his eyes did. A small tightening, the kind that happened when a man encountered a fact that confirmed what he'd feared rather than what he'd hoped. Who sent it? She said. I don't know with certainty. With uncertainty, then. He was quiet for a moment. He set down his cup. There's a clerk in the Royal Accounting Office, name of Severin Marsh. He served under your father-in-law's finance minister, and he's been uncomfortable for some time. I've spoken with him twice in the last year. Nothing actionable. Just a man signaling that his conscience is heavier than his loyalty. And you think this is his? I think the handwriting matches what I remember of his correspondence style. I think he would know what they're planning, and I think he would be frightened enough to send it without signing it. Aldous paused. I also think if I'm right, it means the timeline is shorter than anything I'd prepared for. Serafina looked at the letter. What does not waiting until the assembly mean specifically? What moves before that? Aldous crossed to the desk and sat down across from her, which was something he rarely did. He was a standing meeting man, a pace-the-room man. The sitting told her something. There is a provision, he said, in the original Ashbourne succession charter. Old law predates the current reign by 4 generations. It allows the sitting monarch to petition the Crown Council for a formal review of the Queen's fitness. Not to rule, the Queen has no independent rule under current statute, but her fitness as consort, her fitness to hold the title. Serafina felt something go very still inside her chest. Fitness, she said. It's been used twice in 400 years. Both times the Queen in question had produced no heir and was, the language of the time is not kind, deemed constitutionally incapable. The provision requires a medical assessment, testimony from 3 senior court members, and a Crown Council vote. He looked at her. If Cedric moves that provision, and if the Council votes in his favor, he can strip your title without requiring grounds of treason or misconduct. He simply has the Council declare the marriage deficient. And then Morel becomes consort. Not immediately, there's a waiting period. But yes. She breathed. The fire shifted. Outside the window the light was changing again, moving toward something that would eventually be morning, and from somewhere below she heard the first sounds of the kitchen beginning its work, the particular percussion of the palace waking up. How long has he been planning this? She said. I believe since last winter. The gifts to Morel from the royal collection accelerated in the spring. The financial transfers I've been able to trace, and I want to be very clear that what I have is partial and circumstantial, suggest that Lord Caro's office has been in communication with at least 2 Crown Council members in a capacity that goes beyond ordinary governance correspondence. Caro, she said, Caro has wanted Morel's family's northern trading licenses for 2 years. Her family controls 3 of the 5 overland routes into the Eastern Territories. If she becomes consort, those licenses move under the Crown, and Caro's office manages Crown commercial interests. Serafina was quiet for a long moment. So it's not just Cedric indulging a preference, she said. It's a transaction. It has always been a transaction, Aldous said with the flatness of someone stating an old and unpleasant truth. Morel Voss didn't come to this palace by accident. The question is whether you understood, before last night, how far along the transaction was. She looked at him. Now you're asking if I was naive. I'm asking what you know and what you need. She held his gaze for a moment, then, I have 3 years of financial records, names, dates, sums, and the cross-references that give them meaning. I have letters, correspondence that passed through my office as Queen that certain parties should have been more careful about. I have Dara Wynne in the city who has the Voss account movements for the last 4 years. She paused. What I need is the legal mechanism. I need to understand the Crown Council. Who's on it? Who's persuadable? Who's already Cedric's and who's not? Aldous looked at her with something that took a moment to identify because it had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way in this palace. It was respect. Not the formal kind. Not the kind that came with her title. The kind that came from watching someone operate. Justice Arundel, he said. He sent you a message 6 months ago. I'm ready to answer it now. He'll want to meet in person. Tell him the East Corridor before the second morning bell. I'll be there." Aldous nodded slowly. He reached across the desk and picked up the unsigned letter, folded it, and held it for a moment. Serafina. He had not used her name without the title since the early years of her marriage, when the court had still been something close to collegial. Last night was... What he did was intended to make you feel like there was nothing left. I know what it was intended to do, she said. And? She stood, and he miscounted the people in that room who were watching me carry those trunks and deciding something. She took her correspondence case from the desk. How many of the provincial envoys stayed the night in the palace? Aldous thought. 8 of the 12. The Harrow brothers left early, and Envoy Castellan always refuses palace accommodation. The 8 who stayed. I want to know who they're loyal to and who they owe, not Cedric's version of that information, the actual version. She moved toward the door. I also need you to find Severin Marsh today. Don't approach him directly. Find out if he comes to work this morning, what his manner is, whether he looks like a man who posted a letter last night or a man who's pretending he didn't. And if he's the one, then he's going to need somewhere safe to put what he knows, she said. People who are frightened and right are more useful than people who are brave and wrong. I want him frightened and right and pointed in the correct direction. She opened the door. The corridor outside was still empty, the palace not fully awake, the morning not yet requiring anyone to perform their ordinary allegiances. One more thing, Aldous said. She stopped. The medical assessment. The fitness provision. If Cedric moves it, and I believe now that he will, sooner than any of us expected, it will require a physician's testimony. The palace physician is Master Varro. She knew what he was telling her. Master Varro had come to the palace 18 months ago on Cedric's appointment. She had never been able to determine what Cedric had offered him, but Varro had consistently made himself useful in small, soft ways, misplacing records, producing convenient assessments, being present at the right conversations, and absent from the wrong ones. Varro will say what Cedric needs him to say, she said. Yes. Then we need the testimony to not require Varro. She thought for a moment. There's a physician in the merchant quarter. She treated half the palace staff for the fever 2 winters ago when Varro declared it not his concern. Her name is Dr. Inez Call, Aldous said. I know who she is. She's not palace credentialed. She's not, but she's held in the kind of regard that doesn't require credentials, in certain quarters. If the question of your fitness becomes a public one, he stopped. If it becomes public, Serafina said, then we want the public version of medical opinion to come from someone the public trusts. She held his eyes. See if Dr. Call is willing to be found. She left. The garrison was a 15-minute walk from the palace's east gate, through the service yard and past the grain stores and along the low stone wall that separated the palace grounds from the training fields. Serafina had made this walk exactly twice in 11 years. Once when a fire in the storage buildings had required her to personally direct the evacuation of palace records, and once when she'd needed to deliver a message to the garrison commander that she hadn't trusted to any other hand. She made it now in the half-light of early morning, alone, in the same burgundy gown she'd worn to the night of abundance. She had considered changing and decided against it. There was something useful about arriving as she was. No prepared presentation, no pageantry. Just the Queen of Ashbourne, walking to see a general at dawn, wearing the dress she'd been publicly humiliated in less than 8 hours ago. General Bryce Thane was waiting in the garrison's outer office. He was a broad man, somewhere past 50, who had the particular physical economy of someone who had spent decades learning to conserve energy for when it was actually required. He'd served in 3 separate military campaigns under the old king, survived all 3, and returned to palace service with the kind of quiet authority that didn't advertise itself. He was standing when she came in. He didn't bow, not because he was disrespectful, but because he and she had never required it from each other, one of the small dignities she had preserved in the absence of larger ones. Your Majesty, he said. General. There was a table and 2 chairs. They sat. Your father, Thane said, told me once that the debts we don't collect are the ones that matter most. Because when you finally call them in, the other party knows you meant it. He was right about most things, she said. He was right about that. He looked at her steadily. The man had eyes that didn't move much, which she had always found easier to read than eyes that moved constantly. I watched what happened in the hall last night. I know. I watched you walk out. I watched the room after you left. She waited. There are 7 officers under my command, he said, who I would describe as loyal to the Crown of Ashbourne rather than to its current occupant, by which I mean they understand the distinction and have made their choice accordingly. He paused. The Royal Guard's commander is a man named Petch. Petch was appointed by Cedric 4 years ago. I would not count Petch. I'm not asking you to move against anyone, she said. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not planning a rebellion. I'm planning a legal case. I understand the distinction. What I need from you is information. Who in the Royal Guard would follow an order they considered unlawful, and who wouldn't, where the loyalty lines are in the palace security structure, and, she looked at him directly, whether, if the Crown Council were to convene in an emergency session and require the Guard's neutrality rather than its partisanship, you believe that neutrality could be enforced. Thane was quiet for a long moment. The garrison was beginning to come alive around them. Voices outside, the sound of the training yard starting up, the ordinary morning machinery of a military installation. The Guard has 30 members, he said finally. Of those 30, I estimate 12 would follow Petch without question. 11 would do what the law required regardless of Petch's orders, if the legal authority was clear enough. 7, I'm uncertain about. He looked at her. What makes the legal authority clear enough is the question. The Crown Council, she said. If the Council acts, the Guard is bound to its decision. That's charter law, older than Cedric's appointment of Petch. Yes. Then that's the mechanism. She leaned forward slightly. I need the Council to act before Cedric moves his provision. If he gets the fitness review underway first, he controls the framing and the timeline. If we move first, if we bring evidence of misconduct to the Council before he can reframe this as a domestic matter, then the ground shifts. Thane looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, How much do you have? Enough to make them uncomfortable, she said. Not yet enough to make it undeniable. I have days, possibly less, to close that gap. What do you need from me specifically? I need to know if Caro's office has made any approach to garrison personnel, any unusual contact, any conversations about chain of command or guard deployment or the protocols for palace lockdown. If they're moving faster than we think, they'll want to know they control the garrison before they make a public move. Thane's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, and it told her a great deal. There was a conversation, he said. 3 days ago, Caro's deputy, man named Hess, came to the training yard on what he described as a routine inspection. He spoke to 2 officers without my knowledge. Which 2? Both in the uncertain column, he said. Both junior, both with family in the Northern Territories, which Morelle Voss's family happens to control the primary trade routes through. Serafina absorbed this. The shape of it was becoming clearer, and the clarity was not reassuring. This was not improvised. Caro and Cedric and the Voss network had been building this for months, possibly longer, threading their influence through the institutions, the way water threaded through stone, slowly, without drama, and by the time you saw the damage, the foundation was already compromised. I need those 2 officers' names, she said. I'll write them down. And I need Hess watched, not confronted, watched. Understood. She stood. He stood. They looked at each other across the table in the garrison's outer office, with the sounds of the training yard outside and the palace somewhere behind them full of people who were waking up and choosing, with every small choice of the morning, which version of events they were going to believe. Your father's debt, Thane said. What are you calling it in for? His words to you were spoken in trust, she said. I'm asking you to keep trusting. She left the garrison and walked back through the service yard and the palace's east gate, and by the time she reached the inner corridor, the morning had fully arrived. Servants moving, the smell of the kitchen's work coming through the walls, footsteps overhead. The palace was alive and performing its ordinary functions, and in every room and corridor and office she passed, people were carrying their ordinary knowledge without any sense of what it was worth. She was 3 steps from the east staircase when she heard her name. Not Your Majesty. Her name. The way it was said by someone who had decided, in that moment, that the title was secondary. She stopped and turned. Morel Voss was standing in the corridor behind her. She was dressed already, amber again, or something close to it, a morning gown that suggested she had access to a wardrobe Serafina did not recall approving for palace residents. Her gold hair was down. She was 26 years old, and she was beautiful in the way that had clearly been useful to her for long enough that she'd stopped thinking of it as a tool and had started thinking of it as a right. She was looking at Serafina with an expression that was almost curious, not triumphant, not cruel. Curious, the way a person looked at something they were trying to categorize. "You were up early," Morel said. "I often am," Serafina said. "Where did you go?" The directness of it was interesting. Not a casual question dressed as small talk. A direct question asked in the tone of someone who believed she had the standing to ask it. "Out," Serafina said. Morel tilted her head slightly. "You're not what I expected," she said. "I thought last night would... I don't know. I thought it would look different on you." "What would?" "Losing." She said it without particular cruelty, which was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. "Cedric said you'd be quiet after. He said that's how you handled things. Quiet." Serafina looked at her for a long moment, at the youth of her, the assurance of her, the way she was standing in the corridor of a palace as though she'd arrived in it legitimately and intended to stay. She thought about the ledger in her correspondence case. She thought about Dara Wynn and the Voss account movements and the northern trading licenses that had made Morel a useful transaction for Lord Caro. She thought about what Morel didn't know she didn't know. "He's right," Serafina said. "I am quiet." She turned and walked to the staircase and went up. Behind her she heard nothing. Morel didn't call after her, didn't say anything further, which meant she'd either been satisfied by the answer or unsettled by it, and either way Serafina didn't need to know which. She reached the east guest room and opened the door and went to the small table at the window. The morning light was fully up now, pale and clear, the kind of light that made everything look more defined than it actually was. She opened her correspondence case. She took out the 3 letters she'd written before dawn. She read them again. Added 4 words to the one addressed to Dara Wynn. Resealed it. Then she wrote a 4th letter. This one to Justice Arundel, not the careful, neutral version she'd been composing in her head for 6 months, but the actual version, the one that said what it needed to say without spending words on caution she could no longer afford. She sealed it with plain wax. Said it with the others. 4 letters, 4 directions, 4 threads of a structure that didn't exist yet, and would only exist if she built it correctly and quickly, and without the kind of mistakes that came from moving before you understood the full shape of what you were moving against. She was beginning to understand the full shape. The unsigned letter was still in her case. She took it out again and looked at it. They're not planning to wait until the Grand Assembly. Somewhere in this palace was a man named Severin Marsh who had written those words in the dark and slipped them under a door and then gone back to his work in the Royal Accounting Office, and was now, this morning, either regretting it or waiting to see what it had caused. She folded the letter and put it back. Then she picked up all 4 sealed letters, opened the door, and went to find the one servant in the east wing she was certain now she could trust with them. Pell Danworth was asleep on the floor outside her door. He had his back against the wall and his chin on his chest, and his uniform jacket pulled up around his shoulders in the inadequate way of someone who'd fallen asleep somewhere they hadn't planned to sleep. And he looked about 12 years old, and he looked like someone's son, and when she touched his shoulder and he startled awake and looked up at her with confused, immediate attention, she felt something move through her chest that wasn't strategy and wasn't calculation and didn't require a name. "I need these delivered," she said. She held out the 4 letters. "Each one goes to the name on the front, not through the hall service. By hand yourself this morning, before the 2nd bell." He was already on his feet, already taking the letters with both hands, carefully, the way you held something you understood to be important. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She looked at him. "After this morning," she said, "things in this palace are going to move quickly, and some of what moves is going to be very loud." She paused. "Stay close to the east wing. Stay out of the main hall. Pay attention to what you hear and keep it to yourself until I ask you to tell me." Pell Danworth looked at the 4 letters in his hands and then up at her, and in his young face she saw not fear, but the particular focus of someone who has just been handed a task they understand is real, and she thought, yes, this one. "Go," she said. He went. She stepped back inside the room and closed the door and stood alone in the small morning light, and for exactly 1 breath she let herself feel the full weight of what the next days required. The precision of it, the speed of it, the margin for error that was essentially 0 given that Caro had already been talking to garrison officers, and Cedric was already 3 steps into a move he believed she couldn't anticipate. 1 breath. Then she opened her correspondence case and began mapping the Crown Council, name by name, writing what she knew of each member's debts and loyalties and the specific pressure points that made them human rather than institutional. Because institutions voted the way power told them to, but humans sometimes voted the way their conscience told them to when the evidence was undeniable enough, and the audience was large enough, and the cost of pretending otherwise was suddenly higher than the cost of telling the truth. She was still writing when the knock came. 3 knocks. Measured, not hurried. She set down the pen, stood. "Enter." The door opened, and the man standing in it was not anyone she had sent for. He was not Aldous or Thane, or any of the provincial envoys, or anyone she had calculated into the morning's architecture. He was a slight man, somewhere past 40, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and the hands of someone who spent long hours with documents, and he was holding his own unsigned letter. The original, the one she'd taken with her, and then left with Aldous to confirm, and looking at her with the expression of a man who has crossed a line he can't uncross, and is steadier than he expected to be. "Your Majesty," said Severin Marsh, "I believe you've been waiting on what I know." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, and before he could speak another word from somewhere deep in the palace's main corridor, she heard the sound she had been dreading and counting down toward, the formal 3-beat strike of the Crown Council's convening bell. Cedric had moved first. 3 beats of a bronze bell, and the world changed shape. Seraphina stood in the East guest room with Severin Marsh in front of her, and the sound of the Crown Council's convening bell still moving through the stone walls of the palace like something alive, and she felt the architecture of the last 8 hours rearrange itself around a single clarifying fact. She was too late, not by days, by hours, possibly by less. Marsh read her face. "How far along are you?" he said. "Far enough to know I needed more time." She looked at him. The gray at his temples, the document handler's hands, the steadiness she hadn't expected from a man who'd spent the night deciding whether to knock on her door. "How far along are they?" The petition was filed before dawn. Caro's office, through the council registrar's private channel. I processed the notation myself when I arrived this morning. He set the unsigned letter on the table between them. "The charge isn't the fitness provision. They changed it." She felt something cold move through her chest. "Changed it to what?" "Misappropriation of Crown resources," Marsh said. "Specifically, unauthorized disbursement of Treasury funds to provincial contacts without the King's knowledge or authorization." He paused. "They're framing your intelligence network as embezzlement." The room was very quiet for a moment. She understood what they had done. They had taken the thing she had built. 3 years of careful, patient reconstruction of the informational structure Cedric had dismantled when he removed her from governance, and they had reframed it as a crime. Every meeting with a provincial envoy, every payment to a contact, every arrangement she had made to ensure that information moved through channels the King's men didn't control, all of it, in Caro's framing, became evidence of a queen stealing from her own palace. It was elegant. She hated how elegant it was. "What evidence do they have?" she said. "Enough to make the council open the session. Whether it's enough to make them vote—" Marsh stopped. Something moved in his face. "Your Majesty, there's something else." She waited. "The account records they're submitting as evidence." He looked at her with the expression of a man delivering a verdict he took no pleasure in. "They came from inside your correspondence system. Specific entries, specific dates, specific payment amounts. Detail that isn't in any official Treasury record. The only way they have that level of specificity is if someone with direct access to your private documentation provided it. Serafina stood completely still. Someone with direct access to her private documentation. Not the treasury records, which Caro's office could have mined legitimately. Not the official correspondence, which was visible to any senior clerk. Her private documentation, the ledger she kept in the locked compartment of her correspondence box, the one written in her own hand in the private notation she had developed for exactly this purpose. She thought about who had been in the East guest room since last night. She thought about the correspondence case, which she'd carried herself, and which had not left her side since she'd packed it in the royal chamber. She thought about the 3 letters she'd written before dawn, which Pell had carried out this morning, and the 4th letter she'd written to Arundel, and she thought about every hand that had been close enough to her private records to read them. She thought about Aldous. No. She stopped that thought before it finished. Aldous had been standing at his window when she arrived. He hadn't known she was coming, hadn't had time to copy anything. And the detail in the petition predated this morning. Marsh had processed the notation when he arrived, which meant it had been filed in the pre-dawn hours, which meant the information transfer had happened before she woke. She thought about who had access to the royal chamber before she'd packed her things. She thought about who had known the content of her correspondence system. She thought about Dara Wynne. The name arrived in her mind like a stone dropping into still water, and the ripples moved outward through everything she thought she had understood about the last 3 years. Dara Wynne, who had served as her personal secretary. Dara Wynne, who Cedric had removed 3 years into the marriage, and whom she had never questioned removing because she had attributed it to Cedric's discomfort with the quality of information Serafina possessed. She had never once considered that the removal might have been negotiated, that Dara Wynne might have been extracted rather than expelled, that the woman she'd sent a letter to this morning, the woman she'd trusted with the Voss account movements, might have been the source of every leak she'd never been able to explain. Marsh was watching her. "You've worked something out," he said. "I've worked out that I'm more exposed than I believed." She said it without inflection. The alternative to inflection right now was something she couldn't afford. "The letter I sent this morning to an account keeper in the merchant quarter, is there any way to intercept it before it's delivered?" Marsh was quiet for a moment. "Not through official channels. Not without tipping Caro's office that you know the case is compromised." He paused. "How was it sent?" "By hand, a palace servant." "Then it depends on the servant." She thought about Pell Danworth asleep on the floor outside her door, 16 years old. His mother had taught him letters and numbers both. He'd stood outside her room for an hour before he could make himself knock. She thought about 4 letters in his careful hands, and she thought about the particular vulnerability of an honest person moving through a palace that had been corrupted at every level she'd trusted. "I need to find him before he reaches the merchant quarter," she said. She moved to the door. Marsh stepped back, and then he said, "Your Majesty." She stopped. "The council convening bell means the session opens within the hour. They'll want you present. Caro's petition names you specifically, and under charter law you have the right to respond before any vote. But if you're not in that room when they call for you..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She looked at him, a slight man past 40 with document handler's hands, and a conscience that had cost him a night's sleep and was about to cost him considerably more. "Why did you come to me?" she said. "Not just the letter, this morning. You didn't have to knock." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "I worked under your father-in-law for 9 years, he said. "I have watched this kingdom's accounts for 15. What Caro has been doing to the treasury, what he's been doing to the trade ledgers, to the provincial allocation records." He stopped. "I'm not a brave man. I want to be clear about that. But there is a point past which watching becomes a choice, and I reached it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, "When the council calls for me, tell them the Queen is coming. Tell them she requested a brief interval to gather documentation relevant to the petition." She picked up her correspondence case. "That will buy me 40 minutes. And if it doesn't, then I'll be late," she said, and left. The palace corridors were awake and moving now, the ordinary morning current of servants and clerks and household staff, and Serafina moved through it in the direction of the main gate with the particular controlled urgency of someone who had not yet decided whether to run. Running would be noticed. Not running might mean arriving too late. She found Pell at the base of the main staircase, thank everything that didn't require naming. He was 12 steps from the main corridor, still inside the palace walls, delayed by a broken latch on the east service door that opened to the courtyard. He looked up when he saw her coming, and his face did the thing it always did, which was show her immediately what he was feeling. "The letters," she said. "Haven't gone yet, ma'am. The door—" She held out her hand. He gave them to her. She flipped through them and found the one addressed to Dara Wynn and held it. Looked at the others. Thought. The letters to Aldous and Thane she pressed back into his hands. Those two, still. Now. She kept the Wynn letter and the one addressed to Arendelle. "Go." He went. She stood at the base of the staircase with Wynn's letter in her hand and thought about the 3 years she had trusted this woman's absence, the way you trusted a door you believed was locked without checking the lock. She put the letter in her correspondence case. Evidence. If Wynn had turned, then the letter itself was dangerous, but destroying it was worse. It was the only record she had of the communication, and she needed to understand precisely and documentably what Wynn knew and when she had begun sharing it. She went to find Justice Arendelle herself. Arendelle was in the East Library, which was where senior jurists went when they wanted to be technically findable while practically inaccessible. It was understood in palace culture that the library was a place of work and that interruption required cause. He was standing at the long table with 2 open volumes in front of him and a third in his hand, and when Serafina came through the door, he set the 3rd book down with the deliberateness of a man who had been expecting her. "Your Majesty." He was 61 years old, long and angular, with the quality some jurists developed of appearing to listen to things that hadn't been said yet. "I received your letter an hour ago." "Then you know the situation." "I know your version of the situation as of this morning. I've since learned there's a Crown Council session opening within the hour." "Caro filed a petition," she said. "Misappropriation charge. The evidence they're submitting was taken from my private documentation, which means I have a leak I didn't know about until 30 minutes ago." She paused. "I need to know if the session can be challenged on procedural grounds. The filing timeline, the notification requirements, the charter provisions for contested petitions." Arendelle was quiet for a moment in the particular way of a man running legal architecture in his head. Under the original charter, a contested petition requires minimum 48 hours notice to the named party before a full council vote can occur. If the petition was filed this morning, before dawn, I have a witness who processed the notation. Then you were not notified within the required window. That's a procedural defect. He picked up one of the open volumes and turned it toward her, pointing to a passage. She looked at it. Old script, the cramped legal notation of 4 generations back. The council can open a session on a contested petition without the 48 hours. What they cannot do is vote. They're convening to hear the petition read, to establish standing. The actual vote cannot occur until 48 hours from your official notification. He looked at her over the volume, which has not yet happened. When does notification become official? When it's delivered to you in writing by the council registrar in the presence of 2 witnesses. She thought about the council room, about who was in it and what they were being told and how Caro had planned this morning. She thought about whether Caro knew the 48-hour provision and had built around it, or whether he was counting on her not knowing it. "I need to be in that session," she said. "Yes," said Arendelle, "and I'm coming with you." She looked at him. "As what?" "As Justice Arendelle," he said simply. "In the capacity that title has always held, which has nothing to do with whoever currently sits on the throne." He picked up his 3rd volume and closed it and set it on the table. "I sent you a message 6 months ago." "I know." "You didn't answer." "I wasn't ready." He looked at her steadily. "And now?" "Now I'm walking into a council session with a procedural challenge and a leak I haven't fully mapped and evidence I haven't finished building." She met his eyes. "Yes, now." They walked together through the palace's main corridor toward the council chamber, and the corridor was not empty. It was full of the particular traffic of a palace that has felt a disturbance and is sorting itself around it. Small clusters of conversation that went quiet as Serafina passed, faces that turned and registered and looked away. She kept her pace even and her spine straight and did not look at the faces, which was not because they didn't matter, but because what they saw right now needed to be a queen walking with purpose, not a woman reading the room. The Crown Council chamber was at the palace's administrative core, a circular room with 6 seats arranged around a central table and a 7th chair, the petition chair reserved for the party named in any formal action, positioned facing the council's arc. Lord Caro was already present, standing near the far wall with his deputy Hess, and a man Serafina recognized as the palace's senior legal clerk. 2 council members were seated. A third was taking his place as she entered. Cedric was not there. That was the first thing she registered, and it took her a moment to understand it. The king's absence from a Crown Council session he had presumably orchestrated was either an oversight or a calculation, and Cedric very rarely made oversights. Caro saw her enter. His face moved through something too fast to read completely. Surprise, she thought, and then the rapid reconfiguration of a man adjusting his strategy. "Your Majesty," he said, with the tone of someone performing courtesy they don't mean. "We weren't certain you'd be joining us." "Lord Caro," she said. She moved to the petition chair without hesitation and sat. Arundel positioned himself to her left, not seated, standing, which in the council chamber's protocol indicated he was present in an advisory or legal capacity. "Justice Arundel is here in his judicial capacity. I trust the council has no objection." The 2 seated members exchanged a glance. The third, still taking his seat, looked at Arundel with something careful in his expression. "The session was called as a preliminary hearing," said Councillor Weth, the eldest of the 3 present, a dry man in his 70s who had survived 6 changes in palace administration by the simple mechanism of outlasting everyone who tried to remove him. "The petition will be read into record." "Before it is," Serafina said, "I want to establish a procedural point for the record." Caro made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "The petition names me as respondent," she continued. "The charter requires 48 hours' notice to the named respondent before any vote can occur. I have not yet received official notification. I want that on record before the session proceeds." Weth looked at the legal clerk. The legal clerk looked at his documents. "The notification," Weth began, "has not been delivered," Arundel said, in the tone of someone stating a fact so elementary that discussing it was a waste of everyone's time. "The 48-hour provision is not discretionary. It's charter law. The council may hear the petition read. They may not vote until the window has passed from the moment of official notification." The chamber was quiet. Caro said, "The petition was filed in good faith within—" "The petition's filing timeline is not in question," Arundel said. "The notification requirement is a separate procedural matter. It protects the respondent's right to prepare a formal reply. Removing it would be a charter violation regardless of the petition's merits." Weth looked at Caro. Caro's jaw was working very slightly, the way a man's jaw worked when he was recalculating against an obstacle he hadn't built around. "The notification will be delivered today," Caro said. "The council can proceed with the reading now, and the notification will be delivered now," Serafina said, "while I'm present. So the clock begins in this room, with witnesses." She looked at Weth. "Unless the council prefers to proceed in a manner that a senior jurist will be required to formally contest." Weth looked at Arundel. Arundel looked back at him with the expression of a man who had been doing this for 40 years and had no intention of blinking. "Deliver the notification," Weth said to the legal clerk. The clerk prepared the document. It was handed to Serafina in the petition chair. She read it, the formal language of the charge, the names attached to the petition, Caro's office listed as the primary petitioner, and behind Caro's name, 2 Crown Council members listed as co-signatories. She read those 2 names. One of them was Councillor Aldous. The room did not change. The light was the same. Arundel was still standing to her left, and Caro was still at the far wall, and the legal clerk was still holding his documents. Everything continued exactly as it had been. But the ground had shifted 3 feet to the left, and she was standing on air. Fenwick Aldous, who had served her father-in-law, who had stood beside her at every night of abundance for 11 years, who had met with her this morning before dawn in his study with the low fire and the tobacco ghost, who had told her about the fitness provision and named Caro as the architect of the corruption and given her the shape of the threat in terms specific enough to be useful, and she had believed him. She had used everything he told her to build this morning's response, and she had not once asked herself why he had known so much. She had not asked herself how a careful, measured, uncommitted man had known in such precise detail exactly how Caro's plan was structured. She had attributed it to years of palace experience, to loyalty sharpened by last night's humiliation, to the debt of a man who had served a good king and was deciding, finally, to honor that service. She had not considered that the detail was precise because he was part of it, that he had been in that study this morning not to give her intelligence, but to give her just enough intelligence to use, to direct her attention and her movements in the directions they needed her to go while the petition filed itself in the hour before she woke. She had told him about Darrow Wynn. She had told him about the letters. She had told him about Arundel and Thane and the procedural challenge she was building. She had told him everything. The document in her hands had his name on it, and had probably always had his name on it, and she had walked into his study this morning and handed him a map of her own defense. She signed the notification receipt without letting her hand change speed. She handed it back to the legal clerk. She looked up at Counselor Weth and said, "The clock begins now. The council will have my formal reply in 48 hours." She stood. "I look forward to the full session." She walked out of the council chamber with Arundel beside her, and she did not look at Caro, and she did not look at the chair where Aldous' co-signature sat in the record, and she did not slow down until they were in the corridor outside and the chamber door had closed behind them. Then she stopped. Arundel said nothing. He stood beside her and was quiet, which was what she needed from him, and which he seemed to understand without being told. She thought about this morning. She thought about Aldous' face in the firelight and his cup set down on the desk, and the particular weight of a man deciding to sit rather than stand. She thought about everything she'd said in that room, the names, the mechanisms, the evidence she had, and the evidence she still needed. She thought about 48 hours. 48 hours was not nothing. It was not the position she'd wanted, with Marsh's documents and Darrow Wynn's account records and Thane's garrison intelligence assembled into something undeniable. It was a fraction of what she'd planned to have. But the 48-hour window was also something Caro had not expected her to invoke, because invoking it required knowing the charter language, and the people who'd told Cedric how she handled things had told him she was quiet. Not that she was thorough. She turned to Arundel. "The co-signatories," she said. "Aldous and who else?" "Counselor Brythe," he said. "Younger man. Appointed 2 years ago. I don't know his particular vulnerabilities." "I do," she said. "His family has a land dispute in the Harrow province that's been sitting in the eastern courts for 3 years. 3 of the 4 judges who could rule on it served under my father-in-law." She looked at Arundel directly. "Aldous told me this morning that General Thane's loyalty is sound. I now have to assume Thane was named to me specifically to take him off the board, either because Thane is also compromised, or because putting me in contact with him exposes me." "Which do you believe?" She thought about Thane in the garrison, the 2 garrison officers Caro's deputy had spoken to, the ledger of things Thane had volunteered. "I believe he told me the truth," she said. "I believe Aldous gave me true information about Thane because Thane genuinely is loyal, and sending me to the garrison this morning was a way of occupying my time while the petition filed." She paused. "Aldous is very good. He's been very good for a very long time. He gave me just enough real intelligence that I can't dismiss everything he told me. I have to sort it piece by piece." "You have 48 hours. "I have 48 hours, she said, "and a leak in my documentation, and a co-signatory on the petition who I met with this morning and told everything to, and a contact in the merchant quarter who may or may not have been feeding my correspondence records to Caro's office for 3 years. She stopped, let the full weight of it sit for exactly 1 breath. "And Marsh." "The accounting clerk." "Marsh is real," she said. "He came to me. He wasn't sent to me. If he was Caro's, there was no reason to tell me the charge had changed from the fitness provision. That would only alert me. He told me because he didn't know how much time I had, and he needed me to know the shape of it." She looked at Arundel. "He's the one piece I'm certain of." "Then start there," Arundel said. She nodded once. Then she turned and looked back at the closed door of the council chamber, behind which Caro was now adjusting his 48-hour timeline and discovering, she hoped, that procedural law was deeply unglamorous and entirely effective. I need to change everything, she said. Every contact, every channel, every assumption I made this morning based on Aldous' information. I have 48 hours to rebuild what I thought I had before dawn and do it without using any of the architecture I already disclosed. She said it clearly, with her eyes open, because clarity was what she had right now in place of options. The particular sharpened clarity that came when you had been stripped of every comfortable assumption, and the thing that remained was simply what was true. She had been betrayed by the person she'd trusted first. She had walked into the enemy's study and handed him the map. She had done it with her eyes open and her reasoning sound and her years of careful work behind her, and it hadn't been enough. And now she was standing in a palace corridor with 48 hours and a legal window and a clerk named Marsh who was frightened and right. And every instinct she'd spent 11 years refining was telling her that the version of Seraphina Vale who operated through patience and discretion and the slow accumulation of unremarkable power was not the version that was going to survive the next 2 days. The woman she had been this morning was already gone. What replaced her was not rage. Rage was a luxury she couldn't afford and a signal she couldn't send. What replaced her was something colder and more purposeful, the version of herself she had been building toward without knowing it, the version that had nothing left to protect except the thing that actually mattered. She turned away from the council chamber door. "Get me Marsh," she said to Arundel, "and every financial record he can remove from the accounting office without being seen doing it. I need them in the East Library within the hour." She walked. Behind her, the convening bell struck once more. The session opening in full, Caro reading his petition into a record that now had her procedural challenge attached to it, the council settling in for a hearing that could not yet produce a vote, and that she intended to make very costly before those 48 hours were done. Somewhere in this palace, Aldous was listening to it too. She hoped he was enjoying the brief window in which he still believed he had won. The East Library smelled of old parchment and cold stone, and Seraphina worked in it for 6 hours without stopping. Marsh came within the first 30 minutes, arriving with a leather satchel that was heavier than it looked and setting it on the long table without ceremony. He'd taken what he could without triggering the accounting office's document log. Copies, mostly, made in the margins of his own work notations, the kind of transcription a careful man did slowly over weeks and months when he understood that the day might come when the original records would disappear. They were not everything. They were enough. Arundel sat across from her and read while she sorted. Neither of them spoke much. There was a quality to working under a hard deadline that stripped language down to its functional minimum. A name, a date, a question, an answer. She had always been able to work this way, in the compressed silence of genuine necessity, but she had rarely needed to, and the experience of needing to now had a particular texture to it. Like running on ground that was softer than it looked, every step a small test of whether it would hold. By the second hour, she had built 3 columns on the paper in front of her: what she could prove, what she could demonstrate as probable, and what she needed. The what she could prove column was not long enough, but it was longer than Caro expected. Marsh knew the treasury. He knew it the way people knew things they had lived inside for 15 years. Not just the records, but the logic of the records. The way money moved through the Ashbourne accounts in patterns that looked administrative but were actually intentional, designed by someone who understood that the best place to hide a transaction was inside a legitimate one. He walked her through it without being asked, pointing to entries with the quiet authority of a man who had been watching this happen for 3 years and had the kind of detailed memory that only developed in people who had known, for a long time, that they were the only one watching. The payments to Morell's family were not listed as gifts. They were listed as provincial infrastructure allocations. A road project in the Northern Territories that had never been tendered, a waterway improvement in the Eastern Corridor that had no construction record, an agricultural subsidy that had been approved by Caro's office and signed by Cedric without council review. Each one was individually defensible. Together, and cross-referenced against the dates of Morell's arrival in the palace and the subsequent movements in the Voss family's trade license applications, They formed a picture that a senior jurist could not dismiss. Arundel did not dismiss it. He organized it. That was what he was, them. A mind that took disordered facts and found the legal spine running through them. And he worked at the table with Marsh's documents and a pen and his own 61 years of jurisprudence and built, in the time available to him, a case that was not complete and was not comfortable but was real. At the 4th hour, Pell knocked. He came in with a message from General Thane, written, not delivered verbally, which told her Thane had understood the risk. She read it. 2 sentences. The garrison officers Caro's deputy had approached had both reported the contact to Thane within the hour of its occurrence, unprompted. Both had refused the deputy's implicit proposal. Both were prepared to make formal statements. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. Aldous had sent her to Thane as misdirection, perhaps. But Thane himself was what he had always been, which meant Aldous had miscalculated the garrison the same way Aldous had been miscalculating Seraphina for years, assuming that the people she trusted were there because of what she gave them, rather than because of who she was. That was the particular blindness of people who operated entirely through transaction. They could never fully account for loyalty that wasn't purchased. She wrote Thane a reply. Formal statements from both officers, submitted to the council registrar before the 48-hour window closed. Thane's own statement regarding Caro's deputy's approach to garrison personnel. She gave the note back to Pell and told him to run. At the 5th hour, Cedric came. She heard him before he arrived. Not his footsteps, but the change in the corridor's ambient sound, the way the small noises of passing servants went quiet in his wake. He opened the library door without knocking, which was how he entered every room he'd decided was his, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. Seraphina at the long table, Arundel to her left, Marsh across from her, documents spread across the full surface of the table in the organized pattern of people doing serious work. His face was the face of a man who had expected to find something else. He'd expected, she could read it in the half-second of recalibration, a woman in a room, isolated, maybe in distress. Not this. Leave us, he said to Arundel and Marsh. Neither of them moved. Arundel looked at Seraphina. Marsh looked at the table. They stay, she said. Cedric's jaw set. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He was dressed as he always dressed during the day, formal enough to project authority, not so formal as to suggest he'd needed to prepare for anything. He looked at the documents on the table with the expression of a man who wanted to appear unconcerned and wasn't entirely succeeding. This is unnecessary, he said. The documents or the session? Both. He moved to the near end of the table and stood with his hands at his sides. The council session was a formality. Caro handles the administrative aspects of the petition. I'm not involved in the specifics. She looked at him. Caro filed a misappropriation charge in your name, she said. You're not involved in the specifics. The petition reflects legitimate governance concerns about the unauthorized use of Cedric. She said his name the way she'd said very few things to him in 11 years, without title, without courtesy framing, without the cushion of careful language. Just his name, in the tone of someone who has decided that the forms are finished. You co-signed a petition with Aldous and Brythe. You filed it before dawn. You didn't notify me through the required channel because you believed I didn't know the channel existed. She paused. You were wrong about that. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his face that wasn't quite surprise. He was not a man who showed surprise easily, but was its near neighbor. The 48 hours doesn't change the outcome, Jats, he said. It changes the timeline. The council will vote in 48 hours, during which time the evidence supporting the petition will be available for review by anyone with legal standing to request it. She held his eyes, including the 12 provincial envoys who attended the Night of Abundance and are still within the palace's jurisdictional reach. Cedric's expression shifted. The envoys have no standing in a Crown Council matter. They have standing as witnesses to a public act by a sitting monarch, Arundel said, from his position to Seraphina's left. His voice was perfectly even. Specifically, the act of directing the Queen of Ashbourne to perform domestic service in a public corridor before 300 witnesses. That act is not a domestic matter. It's a matter of crown conduct. The envoy's jurisdictions all have formal treaty relationships with Ashbourne that include conduct provisions. Cedric looked at Arundel with the look he gave people who had just made themselves expensive. "You're overstepping your position, Justice." "I'm describing the legal landscape," Arundel said. "You're free to dispute my description." The room held. Seraphina watched Cedric absorb the shape of what was in front of him. Not just the table full of documents, not just the 48-hour window, but the specific convergence of legal mechanism and witness testimony and financial record that had assembled itself in this library in the last 6 hours. She watched him understand that the petition he'd filed to simplify his situation had, through the activation of a procedural provision he hadn't known she knew, become a public record attached to a public clock that was now visible to everyone in the palace. She watched him decide. "You'll lose," he said. It was not a threat. It was the pronouncement of a man who had decided to believe it because the alternative was too disruptive to his plans. "Maybe," she said, "but you'll have to win it in the open, in front of the council and the envoys and General Thane's garrison officers and the treasury records that Councillor Marsh has been maintaining with a remarkable detail for the last 3 years. She paused. "And whatever Dara Wynne says when she's called as a material witness." The name landed. She watched it land. His face did something specific and small, a fractional stiffening around the eyes that told her she'd aimed correctly, that Wynne was connected to him at a level he hadn't expected her to know, that he had believed Wynne was a resource so thoroughly covered that it didn't occur to him Seraphina might name her openly. She hadn't known this morning how deeply Wynne was embedded. She'd suspected. Marsh had helped her confirm it in the second hour of work, cross-referencing the payment timelines with the dates of information leaks she'd been unable to explain for 3 years. She didn't yet have everything, but she had enough to know the name was a blade, and she'd just used it. Cedric left without another word. The door closed behind him with a quietness that was worse than a slam. Marsh let out a long breath. Arundel picked up his pen. "We have 31 hours, he said. 29, she said. "We need an hour before the window closes to compile and register. 29 to finish." They went back to work. The night came and she didn't sleep through it. She worked at the library table until the candles burned to their bases and Pell replaced them without being asked. And then she worked with the new candles until her eyes ached and the documents blurred at their edges, and she stood up and walked the length of the library 3 times to clear her head before sitting back down. Marsh fell asleep in his chair at some point past the second night hour. His head dropped forward and his hand still loosely holding a ledger page, and she let him sleep. He had given her everything he had. The rest was a different kind of work, the kind that required legal architecture rather than accounting memory, the kind that was Arundel's domain, and she watched him build it across the table from her with the meticulous care of someone who understood that a structure with one weak joint would be torn apart by men who were looking specifically for the weak joint. She thought, in the hours between midnight and dawn, about Aldous, not with rage. She had examined the rage from a distance and set it aside, not because it wasn't warranted, but because rage was an emotion that required an object, and Aldous was no longer a person she could afford to think of as an object. He was a problem with specific parameters. He was a co-signatory on a petition with access to her full strategic plan as of yesterday morning, which meant Caro's team now knew what she'd known when she walked out of his study, which meant they were building a counter to it. What they didn't know, what Aldous couldn't have told them because she hadn't known it yet herself when she'd left his office, was what Marsh had brought. The treasury records, the specific cross-references, the infrastructure payment scheme. Aldous knew she'd been building financial evidence for years, but the precision of what Marsh had provided was not something she'd had or disclosed. That was the gap. Caro had built his case around a version of Seraphina's evidence that was 3 years old and filtered through Wynne's access and Aldous' knowledge. He did not know about Marsh. He did not know what the last 29 hours had produced. She thought, let him walk into the council chamber thinking he knows what she has. She thought, let Aldous sit in that room and watch it be different. By the time the palace woke around her, the case was substantially assembled. Not perfect. She had stopped expecting perfect around the fourth hour. But it was real, and it was documented, and it had Arundale's name on the legal summary, which was the closest thing to institutional credibility she had access to without a council member's endorsement. She sent Pell to the 8 provincial envoys who had remained in the palace. The message was brief. The council session in 2 hours concerns evidence of financial misconduct by Crown officials. As treaty partners, they had the right to request observer status. The Queen of Ashbourne was informally notifying them of that right in case they were unaware of it. 6 of the 8 sent back confirmations within the hour. At the 9th hour before the window closed, she bathed in cold water in the East Wing's utility room and changed into the plain gray wool she'd sent Pell to retrieve from the wardrobe of the room she was no longer supposed to occupy. Not the burgundy gown of the Night of Abundance, which she had folded and put away as something else entirely now. A record, not a costume. The gray wool was unremarkable and fitted, and the color of someone who had decided this morning that the performance of royalty was less useful than its function. She went to find the 2 Crown Council members who had not co-signed the petition. Councillor Weth she found in his rooms. He was old and cautious and had survived 6 administrations through the particular gift of knowing exactly how much to commit to and exactly when to commit to it. And when she sat across from him with Arundale beside her and laid out, in 30 minutes, the documented shape of what Caro's office had been doing to the Ashbourne Treasury, she watched him listen with the focus of a man updating a very precise internal calculation. He didn't say much. He asked 2 questions, both about the legal provenance of the documents, both answered by Arundale without hesitation. At the end of the 30 minutes, he looked at her with the ancient eyes of someone who had been in palace politics long enough to recognize a real thing when it sat across from him. "The 5th council seat," he said. "It's been vacant since Councillor Marsh Sr. passed last winter." "I'm aware," she said. "Under charter law, the Queen holds provisional appointment authority for vacant council seats in the absence of a formal Crown nomination." He paused. "There has been no Crown nomination for that seat." She held his gaze. "I'm aware of that also." "Then you understand," he said, "that if you were to exercise that provisional authority before the session opens, the vote structure changes." She had known this. She had known it since Arundale had pointed it out in the 5th hour of work the night before. She had turned it over carefully and examined it from every angle, because exercising provisional appointment authority was the kind of move that was entirely legal and entirely decisive, and would be characterized by Caro as a power grab the moment it happened. She had decided sometime before dawn that she did not particularly care how Caro characterized it. She left Weth's rooms. She found Councillor Fentress, the other non-signatory, a middle-aged woman who held the Eastern Provincial portfolio and who had a reputation for scrupulous record-keeping and an unscrupulous memory, in the administrative corridor, which was where Fentress always was at this hour, because she was, by her own description, a person who had never in her career allowed breakfast to interfere with work. The conversation with Fentress was shorter and more direct. Fentress read the summary document Arundale had prepared, asked no questions, handed it back, and said, "The garrison statements are registered." "Before the window closes," Seraphina said. "Then I'll be in the chamber," Fentress said, and went back to her corridor. The hour before the session was the hour Seraphina had nothing else to do, and nothing else to do was the most dangerous condition she knew, because it was the gap in which the full weight of what she'd spent the last 47 hours doing could find her without her defenses up. She went to the East guest room, still her room technically, for the next several hours at minimum, and sat in the chair at the window and looked out at the palace grounds in the early afternoon light. She thought about what winning looked like, not triumph. She had examined triumph and found it unsatisfying as a target. It was a moment, and she was building something that needed to last longer than a moment. What she wanted was a different structural reality. A palace where the financial accounts were visible and the trade licenses were governed by law rather than proximity, where the garrison reported to the Crown's legal framework rather than its occupants' preference, where the people who worked in its corridors knew that the institution they served was something more durable than the personality currently sitting at its center. That was not a romantic aim. It was not even a particularly inspired one. It was the aim of someone who had spent 11 years watching what happened when an institution was stripped of its structure and run on personal appetite, and who had a specific and detailed understanding of the damage that caused. She thought about Cedric. He was not a monster. She had never believed he was a monster. He was a man who had been given too much too early and had never been sufficiently disagreed with, who had mistaken the compliance of people around him for approval rather than caution, who had chosen appetite over governance so consistently that he had stopped being able to tell the difference. He was going to lose not because he was evil, but because he had been careless with things that required care. And the bill for carelessness in a kingdom was eventually paid by someone. She had decided she was not going to be the one who paid it. She stood up, took her correspondence case, walked to the door. In the fifth council seat, the vacant one, which she had filled 2 hours ago with a name she had chosen carefully and would not second-guess, Justice Arundel would be sitting when the session opened. As provisional council member, not merely legal advisor, as someone with a vote. She walked the corridor toward the council chamber. The palace around her was moving at its ordinary afternoon speed, but underneath that ordinary speed something else was moving. She could feel it in the quality of the silences, the way people looked at her in the corridor and then looked at each other. Pell had done his work. Thane's officers had registered their statements. The 6 provincial envoys were making their way to the chamber for observer status. She reached the main hall. Through its archway, she could see the council chamber doors, which were open. The session already beginning, the formal read-in of the docket underway, Caro's voice carrying through the arch in the practiced cadence of a man presenting a case he believed was already decided. She stopped in the main hall. Lord Aldous was standing 20 feet from her near the hall's far pillar. He had not seen her yet. He was watching the chamber doors with an expression she had spent 11 years learning to read, and what she read in it now was not triumph and not confidence, but something closer to concentration. The focused attention of someone who is watching a plan execute and monitoring for variables. He looked up and found her eyes. They held each other's gaze across the hall for a long moment. The distance between them was 20 feet, and it was also every conversation they had ever had, every cup of wine at every night of abundance, every morning in that study with the tobacco ghost and the documents cases, every piece of careful, measured counsel he had given her that she had trusted because she had believed in the particular loyalty of a plain man's plain honesty. She had believed wrongly, and she had rebuilt in 47 hours what he had helped dismantle across 3 years, and she had done it with the materials he hadn't known she had, and she was about to walk through the chamber doors, and he was going to watch her do it and understand. In the moment she stepped across that threshold, exactly how large his miscalculation had been. She looked at him for one more second. Then she walked. The chamber doors were wide open, and the room beyond them held the full Crown Council. Weth in his seat, Fentress in hers, Arundel in the 5th seat, with the formal notation of provisional appointment on the table before him, and the 2 co-signatories, Aldous' seat empty because he was standing in the hall behind her, and Brythe sitting with the careful expression of a man who had just noticed something he hadn't anticipated. Caro at the petition stand. The king's chair, at the head of the council arc. Empty. Cedric was not in the chamber. Cedric was not present for the session he had spent months engineering, and the absence had a shape to it. The shape of a man who had received information between last night and this morning that had changed his assessment of what this session was going to produce. Someone had told him. She stepped through the doors and into the room, and every head turned. Caro went completely still. His eyes went to Arundel in the 5th seat, then to Weth, then to Fentress, then to the document summary on the table before the council arc, which he had not seen before this moment, and which Arundel had placed there in the last hour. The compiled and registered case, cross-referenced and signed. His face moved through the rapid mathematics of a man who had built a structure around a set of assumptions and was discovering in real time that the assumptions were wrong. The weight of every injustice she had carried, every trunk she had dragged, every night she had spent in rooms she hadn't chosen, every silence she had held while men who believed she was manageable made their plans around her. All of it compressed into this single, airless moment as she took her place in the petition chair and looked at Caro across the table. "Counselor," she said, "please continue." Caro opened his mouth, and from the chamber side entrance, a door Seraphina had not been watching, Cedric Ashbourne walked in. He was not alone. He had 4 Royal Guard members with him, not Thanes, not the garrison officers who had refused Caro's deputy, but 4 she recognized as Petch's, the guard commander's men. The 12 Thane had said would follow Petch without question. They were in full formal uniform, and they were positioned without ambiguity. And behind them, barely visible in the doorway's shadow, was Aldous, who had not stayed in the hall, who had walked the short route around, who was now standing behind the king's guard with the expression of a man watching a calculation land exactly where he'd placed it. And Seraphina understood in that moment with the particular cold clarity of someone who has just seen the full shape of a trap that she had been right about everything she'd built in the last 47 hours, and right about Marsh, and right about Thane, and right about the procedural challenge, and right about every piece of evidence on the table, and that Aldous had known she would be. He had known, when she'd walked into his study and told him everything, that she was capable of building exactly what she'd built. And he had let her build it. He had given her the 48 hours and the procedural window and the space to assemble the case, not because he'd underestimated her, but because the case was not the target. She was. Cedric looked at her across the chamber with the 4 guard members positioned between her and the door and said, "This session is suspended pending a security review of the documents submitted to the council record." The chamber went completely, devastatingly silent. Weth said, "On what grounds?" "The documents were removed from a restricted archive without authorization," Cedric said. "The individual who removed them is subject to immediate detention pending investigation." His eyes moved to Marsh. Seraphina's hand was flat on the table. Her breathing was even. She was looking at Cedric, and she was thinking about the 4 guard members, and she was thinking about Arendale's provisional council seat, and the 6 provincial envoys standing against the chamber's far wall with the very specific expressions of people who are witnessing something they had not been told to expect, and whose treaty obligations were suddenly extremely relevant. She was thinking about the distance between here and the point of no return, and she was thinking that they had just crossed it, all of them, in both directions simultaneously. There was no version of the next 60 seconds that did not change everything. She looked at Cedric, at the guard, at Aldous in the doorway. She looked at Petch's 4 men, their positions, their hands, the particular quality of attention they were paying to the room, and she looked at what was between them and the chamber's main doors, and she thought about the 6 provincial envoys and what their treaty obligations required them to report, and she thought about Thane in the garrison and the 2 officers who had refused Caro's deputy and the formal statements that were already registered in the council record and could not be suspended because they had been submitted before this moment and were now part of a documented public record that existed outside this room. She thought about all of it in the space of one breath. Then she stood up. She stood up, and the room held its breath. Not the theatrical breath of a crowd-watching spectacle, the compressed, involuntary breath of people who understood that what was happening in the next 30 seconds was not reversible. The 6 provincial envoys against the far wall had gone completely still. Arendale had his hands flat on the table before him. Weth was watching with the eyes of a man who had survived 6 administrations by knowing exactly when a situation had left the territory of politics and entered the territory of history. Seraphina looked at the 4 guard members between her and the door. She looked at Cedric. She said, "Detaining Councillor Marsh requires a formal warrant signed by 2 sitting council members. You have 2 co-signatories on the petition, one of whom is not present in this room." She paused. "You need Aldous in a council seat to make that warrant legal. And Aldous taking a council seat right now, in this session, which is already in record, will constitute a conflict of interest that voids his co-signature on the original petition and triggers an automatic review of the petition's standing." The chamber was silent. "So you can detain Marsh," she said, "and lose the petition, or you can let this session proceed." Cedric's face was doing something she had never quite seen it do before. Not rage. He was past the age where rage came to his face unchecked. Not calculation, which was what he'd worn in the council chamber last night when he'd believed the session was already won. What was on his face now was the expression of a man standing on ground that has just moved, and discovering that the thing he'd been using to stabilize himself was the thing that had moved. She had spent 11 years learning his face. She had earned this read. He looked at Caro. Caro said nothing. Caro was a man who had built an elaborate mechanism and was watching it encounter a variable it had not been designed for, and the particular paralysis of that moment was visible in the stillness of his hands at the petition stand. A stillness that was not calm, but its impersonation. One of the provincial envoys, Envoy Docile from the Harrow corridor, a compact woman in her 50s who had a reputation for direct address that her colleagues found exhausting and Serafina had always found clarifying, spoke from the far wall. "I want the record to reflect," Docile said, in the flat tone of someone dictating a formal notation, "that the treaty representatives of 6 provincial jurisdictions are present as observers to this session and have witnessed the introduction of armed guard members into an active Crown Council proceeding without council authorization." The legal clerk's pen was moving. He was writing it down. He was writing it down because it was his job and because he was one of those people who understood that when the ground shifted, the documentation was what lasted, and he was going to be on the right side of the documentation if it took everything he had. Cedric looked at the envoys. He looked at the clerk's moving pen. He looked at the 5 council seats. Weth, Fentress, Arundel, the 2 empty co-signatory seats, and the weight of a chamber that had tilted in the last 60 seconds beyond the point where guard members at the door changed the arithmetic. He said, "Stand down." The 4 guard members stepped back, not out of the room, back. Enough to signal compliance, not enough to concede the space. Petch's men, following Petch's assessment of what the situation now required, which was the response of professionals who served power and were recalibrating which direction power currently ran. Serafina sat back down. She sat down and she put her hands on the table in front of her and she breathed once through her nose, and she did not let any of what was moving through her body reach her face. What was moving through her body was not triumph. It was closer to the feeling she imagined a person had when they had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had finally set it down. Not lightness exactly, because the weight had been there long enough that its absence felt like its own kind of pressure, but something adjacent to relief, something that knew itself to be real. "The session will continue," Councillor Weth said. It continued for 4 hours. What happened in those 4 hours was not dramatic, in the way that the moment before had been dramatic. It was methodical, which was its own kind of devastating. Arundel walked the council through the Treasury documentation in the sequence Marsh had helped organize, the infrastructure allocations that had no infrastructure, the trade subsidy that had enriched the Voss family's northern licenses, the specific dates and amounts, and the cross-references that gave them their teeth. Marsh testified from his seat, not the petition chair but the witness position beside it, speaking in the careful, precise voice of a man who had spent 15 years becoming the person this moment required and who knew it and was not going to waste the knowledge. Fentress asked questions that were surgical. She had the Eastern provincial portfolio, and she understood trade license mechanics in the particular way of someone who had spent a decade preventing exactly this kind of corruption in her own jurisdiction. And the questions she asked Caro, who was required by session protocol to respond as primary petitioner to council queries, were not hostile in their tone and were devastating in their specificity. Caro answered what he had to answer. He was careful. He was experienced. He did not collapse the way a lesser man might have, into denial or bluster, because he understood that the record was what lasted, and he was not going to hand anyone a recording of himself losing composure. But the document summary was in the record now, and Marsh's testimony was in the record, and the garrison statements were already registered and could not be unregistered, and Arundel in the 5th seat was a fact that had been legally established before the session opened and could not be retroactively challenged without triggering a charter review that would take the entire proceeding into the jurisdiction of the High Court. Caro understood, by the 2nd hour, that the misappropriation petition was not going to survive. He withdrew it at the 3rd hour, formally, in the language the legal clerk recorded as voluntary dismissal pending further review of evidentiary provenance, which was the language of a man preserving the option to reframe this as a temporary retreat rather than a defeat. Serafina listened to the words and understood what they were and set them aside. A withdrawal was a withdrawal. The record would say what the record said. After the formal withdrawal, there was a recess. The chamber emptied in the particular way of rooms that have held something significant and need to release it. People moving to the corridor, the envoys clustering near the door, the legal clerk organizing his notation pages with the unhurried care of someone who understood that these particular pages mattered. Serafina did not move from the petition chair immediately. She sat for a moment in the emptying room and looked at the table and thought about the 48 hours and the East guest room and the thin linen bed and 3 years of a locked correspondence box and the sound of a convening bell when she had Severin Marsh standing in front of her and everything she'd believed about her morning had just been wrong. She thought, I am still here. Not triumphant, not restored, just present, still in the room, still in the chair, still the Queen of Ashbourne, which was a title that had been used against her and used to diminish her, and had been, last night, the instrument of a legal attack, and which was also simply what she was. Not by Cedric's permission or the council's vote, but by the structure of the kingdom itself, which preceded both of them and would outlast both of them if she had anything to say about it. She got up and went into the corridor. Arundel was waiting. He said nothing, which was what she needed, and fell into step beside her. The next 2 days moved like the aftermath of a storm. Not peaceful exactly, but with the particular quality of air after violence, when things that had been in motion are settling and what remains is the work of assessing what is held and what is not. The council convened a formal governance review. Caro's office was placed under audit. The trade license applications connected to the Voss family network were suspended pending investigation. Cedric did not fight it. That was the thing she had not fully predicted, and she examined it carefully when it happened. He withdrew from the governance proceedings in the way that certain men withdrew from things they had decided were no longer worth the cost. Not gracefully, not with acknowledgement, but with a silence that was its own form of concession. He was still king. He remained in the royal chamber. He continued to receive official correspondence and sign the documents that required his signature. But the particular energy he'd brought to the campaign of the last months, the calculation, the orchestration, the Morel project, went out of him like air from a bellows. She thought about this. She thought about what it meant that a man who had spent a year constructing an elaborate mechanism for removing her could, when that mechanism was dismantled, simply stop. She thought about what it said about the relationship between power and appetite. That appetite, without resistance, could be mistaken for conviction. That the thing Cedric had wanted was not the thing he'd believed he wanted. He had wanted to win a game he'd invented, against an opponent he had underestimated. And when the opponent turned out to be something other than he'd imagined, the game had lost its interest. That was its own kind of answer about the marriage, about the 11 years, about all of it. She did not forgive him. She was also not carrying anything she recognized as anger. What she had, in the place where both of those would have been, was a clear-eyed understanding of a person who had done damage without fully comprehending what he was damaging, and a decision, not a feeling, a decision, to move forward without requiring anything from him. Not acknowledgement, not remorse. Not the apology she had in various forms been waiting for across 11 years, and which she now understood she had always been waiting for in vain, because the apology would have required him to understand what he had done, and understanding it would have required a capacity for self-examination he simply did not have. She let go of the waiting. It was the smallest and most significant thing she did in the 2 weeks after the council session, and she did it alone, in the East guest room, on an afternoon when the light through the window was the particular pale gold of early autumn and the palace outside was quiet. She did not move back to the royal chamber immediately. That surprised people. She could tell from the way the household staff navigated around her continued presence in the East Wing, the careful, uncertain quality of their movements, the way they watched her for signals about what was expected. She gave them time to get comfortable with the uncertainty because she had learned across the last weeks that the comfort of the people in her corridors mattered to how the institution functioned. And an institution that had been run on fear for years needed time to learn what it felt like to be run on something else. She saw Pell Danworth most mornings. He had taken the position in the East Wing correspondence office she'd suggested, and he was learning it with the focus of someone who understood they had been given something real and intended to honor it. He made her tea every morning without being asked. It was getting better. Still not good, but better, which was its own kind of progress. Morel Voss left the palace on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the council session. The departure was not dramatic. Her trunks were loaded into a carriage by the household staff without ceremony, and she left through the service entrance, which was not a choice anyone had made deliberately, but which was the practical result of the main gate being occupied by the council's audit representatives when the carriage was ready. Serafina did not go to watch. She learned about it from Pell, who mentioned it in passing, and she nodded and said nothing and looked out the east wing window at the autumn light on the courtyard. She thought about the night Morel had stood in the corridor and asked where she'd been. "You're not what I expected," Morel had said. "I thought it would look different on you." Losing, she'd meant. She had thought losing would look different on Serafina. Serafina thought, it didn't look the way either of us expected. Aldous faced the council on a Wednesday morning in the 4th week. She was not present for his testimony, which she had arranged deliberately. She had given the council what she had on his involvement, the co-signature, the pattern of information that had moved from her to Caro's office in the days before the petition, the specific intelligence she'd disclosed in his study that had appeared in modified form in Caro's case preparation notes, which Marsh had recovered from the audit. It was not everything. It was enough. She had not embellished it, and she had not minimized it, and she had given the council the work of deciding what it meant, because the council was the mechanism she had fought to preserve, and she was not going to undermine it by demanding a predetermined outcome. She learned later, from Arundel, that Aldous had not denied it. He had explained it, carefully, in the measured voice of a man who had constructed an architecture of justification over a long period of time, and the explanation had not been the defense she might have expected. He had believed, he said, that the Queen's position was untenable, and that a managed transition to Morel's consort status was better for the kingdom than the prolonged instability of a contested removal. He had believed he was choosing the less damaging of two outcomes. He had not believed, Arundel told her, that Serafina would do what she had done. She sat with that for a long time. She sat with the fact that the person who had known her longest and most closely in this palace had looked at her and seen someone who would need managing rather than someone who would manage. She sat with the particular grief of that, which was different from the grief of betrayal, sharper in some ways, duller in others, because it was not about malice but about a more ordinary failure of sight. She thought about what it cost a person to be consistently underestimated, not just the practical cost, though the practical cost had been enormous and was still being tallied. The interior cost, the slow erosion of certainty that came from existing in an environment that told you, in 100 small daily ways, that you were less than you were. She thought about how long she had carried that erosion without naming it, attributing her own uncertainty to the circumstances rather than to the cumulative weight of other people's insufficient vision. She thought, I am never doing that again. Not as a declaration of war. As a matter of fact, she was done allowing the limits of other people's imagination to function as the limits of her own field of action. Not loudly, not combatively, that she had no interest in combat for its own sake. She had never had that interest, which was one of the things people had mistaken for weakness. She was done with it quietly, comprehensively. The way you were done with a habit that had cost you more than you'd acknowledged. Aldous was removed from his council seat. He was not imprisoned. The council's determination was that his actions, while in breach of his fiduciary obligations, had not risen to the level of treasonous conduct, a determination Serafina did not contest, because contesting it would have required her to argue for a harsher outcome than the evidence strictly supported. And she had decided very early in this process that she was going to follow the evidence wherever it led and not push it further. She had not built this case on appetite. She was not going to administer it on appetite either. He left the palace on a gray morning in the 5th week, with a single trunk, through the main gate. She saw him from the east wing window. He did not look up. She did not wave. The formal governance review concluded at the end of the 6th week. The trade license scheme was dissolved. The infrastructure allocation process was restructured under council oversight. 3 senior officials from Caro's office were removed. Caro himself accepted a reduction in his portfolio's scope that was the administrative equivalent of a very long, very public apology offered without words because words were not what he did, and because the reduced portfolio said what it needed to say. The Crown Council held a formal session on the question of the Queen's role in governance, not the fitness provision, which had been retired into the archive where it belonged, but the actual question of what authority she held and under what mechanisms she held it. Arundel had drafted the framework, Weth had revised it twice, Fentress had signed it without revision and said only that it was overdue. The session was brief and procedurally clean, and resulted in a formal codification of what had been technically true but practically ignored for 11 years. The Queen of Ashbourne was a governing authority in her own right, with specific portfolio responsibilities and independent access to the council, not contingent on the king's cooperation. Seraphina signed the codification as both queen and co-signatory to her own authority, which was the kind of legal redundancy Arundel had described as technically unnecessary and symbolically essential, and she had agreed. She moved back to the royal chamber on a Sunday morning in the 7th week. She had had it cleaned first, a thorough cleaning, the kind that required a full day and the attention of the senior household staff, not because there was anything visibly wrong with the room, but because she needed it to smell like cedar and herb bundles, and the particular soap the laundress used on good linen to smell like itself again before she could come back to it. She stood in the doorway when the cleaning was done and looked at the room. The books were back on the shelf, the ones she'd packed in the first panic of that first night. The writing desk was in its corner. The worn patch on the rug was still there, which she had expected, and which she stood on for a moment before stepping off it, because it was part of the room and she was not going to pretend otherwise. The cedar sachets she'd moved to the east wing table smelled the same when she brought them back. She unpacked the trunk herself. She had help. Pell had offered, and she had accepted, because it was the kind of task that could be shared without diminishing anything. And they worked in companionable near silence, the boy and the queen, putting things back in their places in the room that was hers. When the trunk was empty, she looked around and it looked right. It looked used and occupied and like somewhere a person actually lived, rather than a stage set for a particular kind of performance. She had decided, somewhere in the 7th week, that she was not going to perform this room any differently than she had performed the East guest room, which was to say, she was going to live in it, read in it and work in it, and sometimes pace it in the dark when she couldn't sleep, and she was going to let it be what it was, which was a room in a palace that she had earned and was keeping. Pell left when the trunk was away. She sat at the writing desk and looked at the courtyard through the window. The autumn had deepened while she wasn't watching, the trees at the palace's edge going the particular deep amber red of the season at its turn. She thought about the night of abundance, the candles and the silk and the 300 people and the gilded cups. She thought about standing at the far window with Aldous, watching Cedric cross the hall with Morel on his arm, and the particular quality of the silence when he'd raised his voice and pointed at her. She thought about the 4 trunks and the main staircase and the sound they'd made going up the stone steps, the undignified percussion of someone else's belongings in her hands. She thought about what she'd felt in the East guest room afterward, on the thin linened bed in the dark. The thought that had arrived without drama. A woman who has nothing left to lose has just realized that nothing left to lose is not the end. It hadn't been the end. It hadn't been the beginning either. Not exactly, because the beginning had been 11 years ago, or maybe further back than that. Maybe it had been the moment she was 22 and had believed she was building something and had begun, quietly and without fully knowing it, to actually build. All of the years before the night of abundance were part of the foundation. The ledger in the locked box, the names she'd learned, the servants she'd made it her practice to know, the grief she'd cried through and the anger she'd refined into something more precise, and the patience she'd held in the particular way that was never the same thing as giving up. She had not given up. That was the fact of it. Not the heroic version, not the version with clean lines and a clear moment of decision. The plain version, she had not, on any of the nights she could have, given up. And the not giving up, accumulated across years, had become the thing she was standing on when the ground moved. That was not a lesson she could have taught anyone. It was barely a lesson she could teach herself. It was more like a discovery she had made while living, the way you discovered certain things. Not because you were looking for them, but because you had been somewhere long enough to see them accumulate. She picked up her pen, opened the correspondence ledger, began the list of what still needed doing, which was considerable, which was fine, which would keep her busy for the foreseeable future and in fact for the rest of her governance if she was doing it correctly. The knock at the door was soft. 3 taps, the particular rhythm she had asked for. "Come in," she said. It was Severin Marsh, who had been assigned to the council's financial oversight office the week prior, a position that was unglamorous and essential, and that he was visibly suited for in the way that certain people were suited for the work they'd been doing quietly for years before anyone named it. He was holding a folder of documents, the first quarterly review of the restructured trade allocation process, which she had asked for and he had prepared with the thoroughness she had come to expect from him. He set it on the desk beside her ledger. He looked at the room, the books on the shelf, the cedar sachets, the worn patch on the rug, with the expression of someone noting the specific weight of where they were standing. "The numbers are better than projected," he said. "The northern route revenue has already begun to reallocate properly. It'll take another quarter to stabilize, but the direction is clear." "Good," she said. He looked at her. "Are you all right, Your Majesty?" She thought about the question. She gave it the moment it deserved rather than the automatic answer it usually got. "Yes," she said. "Not easily, but yes." He nodded once, with the gravity of a plain man who understood the distinction and did not require it explained. He left. She looked at the quarterly numbers. They were better than projected. The direction was clear. Outside the window, the autumn afternoon was deepening toward evening, the light going the particular amber gold of a season that knew itself to be ending and was not sorry about it. She had always preferred autumn to the seasons that promised things. There was something honest about a season that simply showed you what had happened, the colors that came when the year was done with growing and was ready to let you see what it had become. She worked until the light was gone. Then she lit the candle on the writing desk, the good one, the one she'd kept in the east wing and brought back. And she kept working, and the palace settled around her into its nighttime register, and somewhere in the corridors Pell Danworth was learning the East Wing correspondence routes, and Arundel was in the library with the revised charter framework, and General Thane's garrison officers were doing their rounds with their formal statements in the permanent record, and the Crown Council of Ashbourne was, for the first time in 3 years, in possession of the actual financial accounts. The candle burned. Seraphina Vale, Queen of Ashbourne, worked. She did not think about the royal chamber floor, which she had already taken back. She did not think about the trunks she had carried, which had served their purpose as the last weight she would ever carry for someone else. She did not think about what the history of this kingdom would say about these months, though she understood that what it said would be shaped by the documents that had been entered into record, by the legal framework that had been codified, by the fact of her continued presence in this room on this night, working by this light. She thought about what the next quarter required, and the one after that, and the shape of a kingdom that had been running on fear and was learning, slowly, imperfectly, one restructured account and one honest notation at a time, what it felt like to run on something else. That was the work. She did it.